Hello again, and welcome to the next of the recordings dealing with the Civil War. When we left off last time, we were talking a little bit about some of the events in what's known as the Western Theater of the war. Battles like Shiloh, the Battle of New Orleans, sort of the gradual conquest of the Mississippi River in 1862 into 1863. The Civil War is actually fought on a number of different fronts. So you have combat that's going on in the ocean and in the Gulf of Mexico. You have events going on in the West. You have events going on in Northern Virginia and areas kind of surrounding that. At other times, you have things happening in Tennessee. By the time the war progresses into 1864 and 1865, you see things happening in places like Georgia or South Carolina. There's even skirmishes happening in places like Illinois and Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma. So it's a very far-flung kind of event. What we're going to look at now is events in 1862 and into 1863 that are really going to pretty significantly transform the nature and, in some respects, even the meaning of the Civil War. When we introduced the war in the first recording, talked a little bit about the war being, for a lot of people at the outset, a matter of the Union, right? Should and could the Union be split by a group of people that felt that their interests were not being represented effectively. So the war doesn't begin specifically about keeping or abolishing slavery. Slavery is at the core of a lot of that, but that's not why people are joining the Union or Confederate armies. Events in 1862 begin to profoundly change the purpose of the American Civil War. And so in order to get to that, we have to talk about what General Robert E. Lee is doing in his invasion of Maryland, and then some of the consequences of that particular action when it happens. So the battles of the sort of northeastern part of the war, in other words, the battles around Virginia, tended to be oftentimes Confederate victories. And this is in 1861 and into early 1862. Robert E. Lee, though, decides that there is an opportunity for him to really significantly change the military standpoint of the war if he achieves a major success in Maryland. So he decides that this is going to do a number of different things. For one, he figures that one or two major victories in Maryland, which is technically a Union state, a northern state, a couple of victories would significantly weaken northern morale. Victories in Maryland would kind of help take the pressure off of Northern Virginia, where a lot of the fighting had been going on. It means that they would be able to, the Confederate Army would be able to resupply itself, feed itself, kind of live off the land in areas that are not part of the Virginia breadbasket, right? In other words, eating food from Maryland means you're not eating food from Virginia. You're not waging war on Virginia soil, and so the damage is going to be less. And you're taking food away, potentially, from the Northern Army because they wouldn't be able to get the food that Maryland is producing. So you're going to relieve some of that pressure on Virginia. You're going to relieve some of the pressure on those southern farms by living off of the land in northern states instead. Maryland is also a slave state in 1862. It was kind of pressured to stay in the Union by Abraham Lincoln. And there are a lot of pro-Confederate residents of Maryland. And so Lee is hoping that a decisive victory or two could cause that state to change sides and leave the United States and join the Confederate States, the CSA. This would be pretty catastrophic for the Northern War effort because since Virginia has already joined the Confederacy, if Maryland were to join the Confederacy, that means that Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by the Confederacy, because D.C. sits on the Potomac River right between Maryland and Virginia. And so if Maryland would change over to the Confederacy, this means that the entire capital of the North would be within the Confederate States, which would be unprecedented, and it would make it virtually impossible for the Union government to actually maintain the war effort. So he's invading Maryland in September of 1862, Robert E. Lee is. This will lead to what's known as the Battle of Antietam. And the Battle of Antietam is a huge, huge turning point in the American Civil War. Not necessarily because of the outcome of the battle itself, but because of what the battle allows Lincoln to set in motion. So, before the battle begins, General McClellan, the Union general that we talked about in the last section, he actually comes across the entire battle plan for Lee's army. Soup to nuts, everything that Robert E. Lee is planning to do in his invasion of Maryland. And this is, in the hands of a more capable general, an absolute godsend, right? A better general would be able to use that battle plan and completely obliterate Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. McClellan is not a capable general. McClellan is paranoid and overly cautious. He's convinced that this is fake, that this is just there to try to trap his army. And so he decides to just kind of shadow Lee's army rather than make use of Lee's battle plan and use it against him. So the two forces meet near a creek called Antietam Creek, near a town in Maryland called Sharpsburg. The battle itself only lasts one day, but it is, even to this point, the worst single day in American military history. More people are killed or injured in the Battle of Antietam than are injured in any other single day in all of American military history. So it is a horrendous, horrendous event. Excuse me, more than 23,000 men taken on both sides are killed or injured or missing. To put it in perspective, if you imagine all of the carnage and destruction and devastation of D-Day in June of 1944, which is, for some people, maybe a more relatable or recognizable kind of an event, that involves about 6,000 American casualties. So this is almost 4 times as devastating as that one event. So hugely, hugely significant from that standpoint. As I said, from a military standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, it is usually regarded as a draw. Neither side manages a decisive victory. Lee ends up leaving Maryland, and so McClellan and Lincoln end up claiming this as a Union victory. That's maybe a bit of a stretch. McClellan has an opportunity to pursue Lee and potentially do even more damage to the Confederate Army, but he chooses not to. But out of the ashes of this battle comes the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Emancipation Proclamation is going to be the thing that, more than anything else, will really transform the nature of the Civil War from being just a matter of, can the Confederacy legitimately leave the United States and form its own country, Or is that not an acceptable, allowable arrangement according to the wishes of the Constitution and the founding generation? The Emancipation Proclamation really does turn the war into a war about slavery. Lincoln has to have a victory in order to issue his proclamation. He has it written, he has it ready to go, but he feels that if he were to issue the proclamation after a Union defeat, it would look desperate, like he's grasping at straws. And unfortunately for Lincoln, McClellan in particular is not really in the business of providing the Union with decisive military victories. So Lincoln has to sort of make the best of a bad situation by using this battle at Antietam as a quote-unquote victory that he can then sort of hang the Emancipation Proclamation on. The Battle of Antietam is notable also because it's one of the very first battles, certainly in American history, where the aftermath is extensively photographed. And these images are two of dozens of images that photographers like Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady take of the aftermath of the battle itself. Photographic technology in 1862 wasn't good enough to actually photograph people in motion, right? So you can't have photographs of the battle taking place, partially for safety's sake, but also partially because it takes too long to actually expose the image, and so all you would get would be blurs. And so the only thing that can easily be photographed is the consequences of the battle. And ultimately what that results in is images of the devastation and death and trauma of the battlefield. And these images, in this case in particular, are put on display in New York City. And they result in a shock to the American public. We talked about the impact of Americans opening up their newspapers after the Battle of Shiloh, and for day after day after day, seeing the casualty lists of people who were killed or injured at the Battle of Shiloh. The same thing is happening in Antietam's case, but for the Battle of Antietam, this is really the first time that people who are not at the scene of the battle itself are actually able to see scenes of the battle. And it is a terrible, terrible shock to people. People who see these images when they're on display in New York City, they break down in tears, they faint. People are described as running out into the street and being physically ill. Because it is not anything that they have seen before. Death is a very present thing for people in 1860 and 1862. So it's very common to be in a family and have lost family members. But that's a very different thing from seeing the kind of injury and violence that mechanized kinds of warfare like this can actually produce. So Antietam is significant for that reason as well. So the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam takes place September 17th, 1862. And as soon as Lincoln has decided that he can use this as a quote-unquote Union victory, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation less than a week later. So the provisional kind of statement comes out September 22nd, and it will officially go into effect on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation is oftentimes kind of a misunderstood document. It did not free all the slaves everywhere in the United States. It only applied to people who were enslaved in the Confederacy. So if you remember in the first recorded section of the Civil War content, I mentioned that there are 4 states, 4 Union states, that are slave states for at least part of the war: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. The Emancipation Proclamation did not affect slavery as an institution in any of those 4 states. It is only freeing slaves in territory that, according to the language of the document, in territory that's in rebellion against the United States. So that's the Confederacy. The purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation, then, since it's not strictly speaking to free all the slaves, that's going to happen with the 13th Amendment that officially gets ratified December of 1863 after the war is over. The purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation is partly to turn the war into a war about slavery, but it's also designed to have an economic impact and a diplomatic impact. So Lincoln is hoping that by freeing the Southern slaves, this will cause a massive disruption to the South's society and the South's economy. He's also hoping that by requiring the South now to be waging war specifically to maintain slavery, that this will kind of sour their perception in Europe, especially France and England. Because now, where France and England had been on the verge of supporting and offering diplomatic recognition to the Confederacy, now Lincoln is hoping that when the French and the English see that the Confederacy is essentially waging a war specifically so that they can maintain slavery, that this will significantly reduce the likelihood of France and England diplomatically, financially, militarily supporting the Confederate cause. Whether that is the case or not is hard to say. The reality is that by 1863, France and England have decided not to support the Confederacy. How much of that is a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, it's hard to say. But it likely did serve a certain purpose. So with the Emancipation Proclamation, what Lincoln has effectively done is say, now the South is clearly only waging war so that they can maintain slavery. I have given them an option within the provisions of this document for them to rejoin the Union as long as they would ultimately allow slavery to die off upon their return. The fact that they refuse to come back into the Union clearly indicates that the whole purpose of the war for them now is to guarantee the institution of slavery in perpetuity. This seems like this would be a wonderful achievement for moral righteousness, right? Finally, the North has recognized that the war needs to be about this particular ethical issue. But it kind of backfires. And one of the ways that it backfires is in a dramatic reduction in enlistments. This is, up to this point, an entirely volunteer army. Lots and lots and lots of Northerners get frustrated at the idea of the war being about ending slavery now. And you see many different kinds of demonstrations and letters and speeches where people say, pretty bluntly, I am not fighting this war to free the black man, to free the Negro. I am fighting this war because the Union cannot be broken like this, and the South needs to be brought back into the family. And so, once the war becomes a war about slavery, the Northern Army begins to struggle to fill its ranks. There's also a certain amount of reality setting in that the war is dragging on and on and on. that the North is not clearly able to bring all of its advantages to the battlefield and achieve those decisive victories that it expected. And so Congress passes a draft. This is the very first draft in American history. It is passed March 3rd, 1863, and it affects everybody, every man from the ages of 18 to 35. And the idea here is to help replenish some of the dwindling numbers of enlistments, of voluntary enlistments. There are a couple of problems with this, though. For one, people who are drafted are expected to serve, even if they don't agree with this new focus of the war being about slavery. In addition, if you had $300, you could essentially pay your way out of the draft. It's called a commutation fee. Basically, this means that if you were among the wealthier class of American citizens, of Northern citizens, you wouldn't have to serve. You could pay $300 and your name would basically be stricken from the draft rolls. Between the Emancipation Proclamation and the inequality that this commutation fee allows for, lots of middle and lower class Northerners see the draft as a really negative thing. And so you have, in places like New York City in particular, massive riots that break out around the implementation of the draft. And some of these riots end up being extremely devastating and violent. In New York in particular, more than 100 people are killed as a result of these riots that go on for days. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, on the one hand, is a wonderful ethical advance where Lincoln is pushing the United States closer to those ideals of equality and freedom and liberty and opportunity. But for the time, at the moment, there are a lot of people that don't perceive that as a positive thing. And so it has some pretty negative consequences, and it backfires pretty severely in a number of ways. So this is going to be our breaking point here. We are right on the cusp of, sort of from a military standpoint, the turn of the tide in the American Civil War. And that's going to be, in many ways, centered on the Battle of Gettysburg in early July of 1863. So when we come back for our next section, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at Gettysburg. We'll look at the sort of changing of fortune, where the Union finally finds a commanding officer that's up to the challenge of defeating Robert E. Lee, and also one who figures out the best way to leverage all of the advantages that the North has in order to finally bring the war to a conclusion. So that's going to be the last of our sections. I hope everybody is doing really, really well. Let me know if you've got questions. Make sure you get into the full PowerPoints that are available on Blackboard. Our final section, when we get to it, is likely going to be a little bit longer than the ones that we've done up to this point. But it still shouldn't be, hopefully shouldn't be too long. So I will see everybody soon, and take care.